In the cultural life of our city, today is a big event. In a few minutes, you will hear for the first time the performance of the Seventh Symphony by Dmitri Shostakovich, our outstanding musician. The performance of the Seventh Symphony in the condemned Leningrad is a testimony to the unwavering patriotic spirit of the Leningraders and their steadfastness and faith in victory and readiness to the last drop of the frost's blood and to conquer victory over the enemy. Listen, comrades. The city of Leningrad, or modern-day St. Petersburg, boasted a population of around 3 million before dropping to less than 800,000 by the end of its siege. In addition to its thriving industrial sector and strategically important position, the city was titled the cradle of Bolshevism. But these factors made Leningrad a high-priority target for the Nazi invasion, with Directive 21 designating the city as one of Barbarossa's primary objectives alongside Kiev and Moscow. In this video, we'll examine how the people of Leningrad held out for over 2 years against overwhelming odds and were ultimately rescued by a stunning Soviet counterattack, thanks to the sponsor of today's video, Raid Shadow Legends. The first game to bring a true console-level experience to your phone. Master countless tactics, equip your team, and choose from over 650 champions with unique skills. This month, Raid released new legendary champion Ronda, based on MMA and pro wrestling legend Ronda Rousey. Ronda trained hard alongside her 7 brothers to become a formidable warrior, as they were expected to be, earning this barehanded fighter the title of Queen of the Arena, as she fought her way from K-Rock to the arena city of Velazar. To add Ronda to your team, log in and play Raid for 7 days between now and February 20. As an extra bonus, use promo code RIDERONDA to level her up with a 3-day 100% XP boost, 500,000 silver, and 5 full energy refills. If you're an Amazon Prime member, you can get your exclusive rewards in Raid right now. For the next 30 days, new players who click my link in the description or scan the QR code will get a free epic champion, Ina.my, 200,000 silver, 1 energy refill, 1 XP boost, and 1 ancient shard, so that you can summon amazing champions as soon as you start playing. All this treasure will be waiting for you here when you log in. Within 2 months of the war in the East beginning, Field Marshal Ritter von Lieb's Army Group North had stormed across hundreds of miles of Soviet territory and arrived at Leningrad's doorstep. With almost no time to prepare, the trapped citizens could only watch in horror and despair as the seemingly unstoppable Nazi juggernaut slammed against the gates of their beloved city. The Red Army had been caught right in the middle of extensive reforms by the June invasion, and hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers had already been encircled and surrendered. Leningrad itself was hugely undermanned and undersupplied, with shortages of everything from food to ammunition. Yet rather than flee the city en masse, the stalwart inhabitants of Leningrad chose instead to resist the invasion with all their might. In the few scant weeks prior to Army Group North's arrival, over 1 million civilian workers had helped dig multiple concentric lines of trenches around the city, and fortified them with everything from reinforced concrete bunkers to improvised timber barricades. While the citizens of Leningrad struggled to prepare for the inevitable, the German advance continued practically uncontested by the demoralized forces of the Red Army. By September 8th, all railway connections to Leningrad had been severed, and the city was only accessible via a single waterway connected to Lake Ladoga. That same day, German bombers struck Leningrad's warehouse district, igniting a firestorm that destroyed most of the city's food reserves. Yet, remarkably, the defenders chose to persevere, and the first German ground troops to assault the Leningrad suburbs found themselves repelled by unexpectedly heavy resistance. Ironically, this was as much Hitler's doing as anybody else's, as he had specifically ordered the commander of Army Group North to refuse any and all offers of surrender from the besieged city. To the Führer, Leningrad represented everything he hated about the Slavic race, and he intended to erase it from history as thoroughly as Rome erased Carthage, or the Mongols had erased the Khwarezmian Empire. Every man, woman, and child still inside Leningrad knew they were marked for death, and this knowledge inspired them to resist their would-be exterminators with every weapon at their disposal. But sheer determination could only carry the defenders so far, and although the city held out against the initial German onslaught, the siege lines proved unbreakable throughout the winter of 1941. As temperatures fell to an estimated minus 40 degrees Celsius, Lake Ladoga froze solid, enabling the construction of the road of life across the resulting ice sheet. But while many vital supplies were delivered to the besieged inhabitants of Leningrad, conditions within the city rapidly worsened to such an extent that the entire wing of the police department was established explicitly to punish acts of cannibalism committed by the starving populace. The police force in general was horribly overworked, as over 8,000 members of the normally 13,000-strong Leningrad constabulary had been conscripted and sent to the front lines prior to the siege. Those who remained now had to pull double duty, acting both as militia to fight off the invaders and officers of the law in a city where murders could be committed over a slice of bread or a scrap of cloth. But even when spring of 1942 brought relief from the Arctic temperatures, new hardships appeared in the form of a trio of massive siege batteries, which the Germans used to turn large sections of the city into smoldering rubble. Unsurprisingly, the Red Army was not simply content to allow a treasured symbol of the Soviet regime to be slowly ground into the dust by German guns, and so launched many enthusiastic but ultimately futile counteroffensives against the besiegers. Among these was the disastrous Battle of Euban, which saw the 300,000-strong Second Soviet Shock Army exhaust itself in a months-long battle of attrition against the dug-in forces of Army Group North, before being utterly annihilated by a German counterattack. The Soviets also launched a series of failed counteroffensives from the Sinevna Heights east of Leningrad. But in August of 1942, rising star Lieutenant General Leonid Govorov arrived to command the Leningrad front and quickly began preparing a third, much larger offensive from this eastern redoubt. By sheer coincidence, Govorov's preparations coincided with Army Group North's own Operation Nordlicht, or Northern Light, a full-scale assault on the trench lines around Leningrad. This meant that when the Red Army began a coordinated attack on German positions near the Sinevna and Maga salient, large portions of the force planned for Operation Nordlicht had to be hastily diverted away from their intended targets to meet them. The result was a bitter stalemate that persisted for 3 weeks, with Soviet casualties exceeding over 100,000 men in exchange for a mere 26,000 German casualties. But Govorov's efforts were successful in forcing the Nazis to cancel Operation Nordlicht, leaving Army Group North in a greatly weakened position overall. Following the Pyrrhic victory of his Sinevna offensive, General Govorov spent the rest of 1942 carefully preparing for yet another assault on the German line. By now, the war in the East was starting to turn against the Axis forces, but Hitler remained fully committed to his genocidal agenda against the Slavic people. Day and night, Leningrad was methodically hammered with artillery fire and Luftwaffe bomber formations, intent on smashing the city to rubble block by block. Attacks on the Road of Life were constant, with bombs capable of shattering the thick ice, often sending whole supply convoys to a watery grave. But still, the starving citizens resisted, working in unheated, unroofed workshops to reload spent shell casings and repair damaged equipment. Astonishingly enough, streetcars and bus stations operated even during the worst months of the siege, while schools continued offering classes to children not engaged in combat-related activities, such as firewatching. Though taxed to their very limits, hospitals and medical services worked around the clock to prevent disease, successfully containing potentially devastating outbreaks of cholera, typhus, typhoid fever. These efforts were all the more impressive, considering that the average worker was surviving on less than 300 calories per day, the equivalent of 3 slices of bread. Fortunately for the embattled citizens of Leningrad, January of 1943 saw General Govarov leap into the fray with Operation Iskra, an offensive designed to break German lines south of Lake Ladoga and link the Leningrad front up with the nearby Volkhov front. The gap between the two fronts was a mere 16 kilometers or 10 miles. However, every Soviet advance in the area would be made under constant artillery bombardment from the guns normally occupied with shelling Leningrad. Additionally, the terrain around Lake Ladoga consisted of heavily forested wetlands, severely limiting the deployment of mechanized units. The only real advantage the Soviets had was that German forces faced a severe manpower shortage and lacked the strategic reserves necessary to launch the kind of aggressive counterattacks and encirclements that had caused such appalling losses during earlier campaigns. After several days, Operation Iskra commenced on January the 12th. Thanks to heavy air support provided by over 800 Soviet planes, troops were able to quickly advance into the gap on both sides. But within 24 hours, weather conditions took a turn for the worse, grounding the Air Force and leaving the Red Army stalled until the 14th. The next 4 days consisted of an incredibly grueling slog through miles of German trench lines, with Soviet forces from the Leningrad front finally linking up with their Volkhov counterparts in the early hours of the 18th. This marked the first time a land connection had been made between the defenders of Leningrad and the rest of the Soviet Union in over a year, and battlefield engineers raced to complete an improvised rail line to the city. Unfortunately, Iskra's overall success was limited, as the bulk of Army Group North remained firmly entrenched around Leningrad, and although supplies could now be reliably shipped into the besieged city, the siege itself was still far from over. This was proven just a few weeks later when the Soviets attempted the much larger Operation Polar Star, intended to encircle large sections of Army Group North and drive them out of the Leningrad region for good. As 1043 dragged on, the situation in the east shifted progressively in favor of the Soviet Union. But despite Operation Iskra eliminating the possibility of Leningrad falling, Army Group North stubbornly maintained the siege throughout the entire year. By this point, Leningrad's population had dropped to as low as 750,000, with tens of thousands having been evacuated after the success of Operation Iskra. The city itself was also remarkably intact, thanks to German troops having never penetrated beyond the outer suburbs. Though enduring unfathomable hardship, Leningrad's industrial sector had never shut down completely, and citizens continued showing up for work even during the harsh winter months. Thanks to their perseverance, the worst of the siege was over, but the road to victory was still long and bloody. However, Polar Star was doomed from the start, as the Germans preemptively evacuated many of the key areas being targeted for encirclement, shortening their defensive lines and leaving the exhausted Red Army forces with no choice but to halt their raid. Advance until the spring thaw. With winter once again on the horizon, General Govarov now sought to replicate the success of his earlier offensives with another January campaign. After consultation with High Command, Govarov formulated a battle plan that called for his Second Shock Army to encircle German forces in Petergov and Strelna regions, while other elements of both fronts flanked the German 18th Army in simultaneous attacks southwest of Leningrad and in the Novgorod region. After destroying the 18th Army, the two fronts would advance toward Narva and Pskov, driving the Germans ahead of them and out of the region. While this was ongoing, German reinforcements would be kept out of the fray by diversionary attacks on Army Group North's right flank from the Second Baltic Front, ensuring the liberation of Leningrad once and for all. After intense preparation, the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive began on the night of January 13, 1944. When a swarm of Soviet night bombers struck targets all across the region. This was followed by an hour-long artillery barrage on the regional airfields being used by the Luftwaffe, suppressing them long enough for infantry and mechanized forces to punch through Army Group North's outer defenses. In less than 24 hours, the Soviets had advanced along a 10-kilometer or 6.21-mile front, creating a salient 3 kilometers or 1.8 miles deep into enemy territory. To the south and east of Leningrad, the 42nd and 67th Soviet armies maintained pressure on German positions during the night, allowing the main advance to push a further 4 kilometers or 2.5 miles. The 15th of January saw Rifle Corps from the 42nd and Sachsenschach Army racing a further 6 kilometers or 3.7 miles, blasting their way through heavy counterattacks from the 3rd SS Panzer Corps in the process. Further to the east, other elements of the 42nd Army were busy giving German positions a taste of daily life in Leningrad by bombarding them with over 220,000 artillery shells in just a few hours. This was followed up by a strong assault against the shell-shocked defenders at the town of Polkovar, opening another deep salient into the enemy line. However, these advances were exceptionally costly, with hundreds of Soviet losses for every bunker, ditch, or trench line pried loose from the German death grip. In fact, initial casualty reports were so lopsided that an unwarranted sense of optimism began to take hold among the German officer corps, with General Major Gerhard Lindemann of the 18th Army predicting that he could defeat the supposedly overextended Soviet force within 3 days. 72 hours later, on the 20th, Lindemann was frantically begging his superiors for non-existent reserves as Govorov's forces ripped through the entrenched Nazi lines that had maintained the siege of Leningrad for over 870 consecutive days. With no possibility of recovering from these devastating losses, Army Group North went into a full retreat, and within a week, the front lines had been pushed back over 100 miles from the city. In many ways, the siege ended just as abruptly as it had begun, with the lightning pace of the Soviet advance mirroring that of Army Group North during Operation Barbarossa. On the 26th of January, Joseph Stalin personally declared the liberation of Leningrad to both the Soviet Union and the rest of the world. Great celebrations broke out all across the city at the news, but even the most enthusiastic citizens could not ignore the devastation surrounding them. Though Leningrad had suffered less damage overall than cities like Berlin or Warsaw eventually would, as soon as their position had become untenable, the Nazis had done their best to obliterate all traces of Russian culture within the region. Special effort had been made to raid Leningrad's many museums and art galleries, with thousands of irreplaceable paintings, statues, and historical exhibits looted or burned by the invaders. Destroyed landmarks included the old palaces of the Russian Tsars, which had previously managed to stay intact even through the Soviet Revolution. In terms of human lives lost, the siege of Leningrad caused at least 640,000 civilian casualties, many of whom were women and children who died of starvation or frostbite during the Arctic winter of 1941. Yet this number was utterly dwarfed by the deaths sustained by the Red Army during both the defense of the city and the many operations undertaken to liberate it. Conservative estimates place Soviet casualties against Army Group North at around 3 million, while German losses amounted to around 500,000. Hitler's obsession with destroying the so-called cradle of Bolshevism is widely regarded as one of his key tactical mistakes during Barbarossa, wasting vast amounts of manpower and resources on a target whose symbolic importance far outweighed its symbolic strategic value.